Good afternoon. This is Don Joseph with the Key Peninsula Historical Society. And this morning I'm here with David Anderson. And David Anderson went to the very first grade here on the Key Peninsula, and he is here to share some of his stories and a little bit of his family history. First off, Dave, I'd like to ask, how did your parents find the Key Peninsula, and when did they move here?
Well, my dad was born here, and his dad, August Anderson, came to the Key Peninsula in 1910 and homesteaded on the family farm there at, near the head of the Falusi Bay. He took out the homestead right, and after a year of improvements on the property, and he built a small home there, he contacted my grandmother, who was his girlfriend at the time. She was in Chicago, had her come out on a train, and married her the day she hopped off the train in Tacoma, and took her out there, and they lived in that farm until they both passed away in their late 70s. So he replaced the original cabin with a new home in 1916, and that was their home until they passed away.
Okay. And so when did you come along on the scene, Dave?
Well, I was born in June of 1937, and my dad was a logger and worked in mills in those days. And my parents lived at Pacific Beach at the time. I was born in Hoquiam, and he went wherever the jobs were. We lived in 22 different homes in 18 years. So we moved around more than most military families move. And so we lived at Pacific Beach for a few months, and then they closed the mill there. And this is right during the Depression. They moved up, he got a job with a logging operation on Hood Canal, and we moved up to Hood Canal, lived there for a few months. And then that logging outfit went broke, and we ended up coming back down here to Longbranch and lived in a place that was only about half a mile from my grandparents' home.
Can you describe a little bit about where that residence was?
That first place, my mom called it the Erickson House. I don't remember it specifically because I was only 3-4 years old. My sister was born when we lived there in March of '39. And when my sister was about 3 months old, that house burned down, and my dad was lucky to save my sister. She was asleep in the back bedroom, and the whole house burned down in like 15 minutes flat.
Wow.
And so we, family lost everything that was in the house. Yeah. Didn't have time to get anything out except my sister. I was happened to be playing in the yard at the time that the fire broke out. So then we moved from there up on top of the hill at Longbranch off of Rouse Road in Art Otto's farm. He had a small cabin up there, and we lived there for about a year. And I remember that place very well because when I was 4 years old there, I fell in a bee's nest. And my mother and a couple of neighbor ladies come out and pulled me out of the nest was in a pile of old lumber. And I was running across this lumber we're playing follow the leader with the neighbor's kids. And I was second in line, and the first kid ran across the lumber pile and stirred up the bee's nest, and I was going across the lumber pile, and I fell down, and the bees were all over me. And they grabbed me and put me in a tub of water. I had 50 bee stings between my elbow and wrist on my left arm. They didn't even bother counting all the rest of them because there were too many of them. And they were pulling bees out of my ears and out of my nose and out of my mouth with tweezers, and rushed me off to a doctor. And I'm not sure where the doctor was, either up by Joe's Bay or may have been all the way to Burley, I'm not sure. But the doctor gave me a shot of atropine, and he said if he's still alive in the morning, he'll be okay.
Wow. So they didn't have to put you on a ferry and have to send you to Olympia at that time?
No,
they had a doctor in proximity. Yeah.
No, a few years later, my mother had an emergency where that was done. I can describe that. But interestingly, my dad had a job in a gravel pit nearby, and about the same time he came home from work one day, and we didn't recognize him because he got stung by 3 hornets right between the eyes, and his face blew up so much that Mom didn't even recognize him when he walked in the house.
Oh, wow.
After we lived in that cabin, we moved down to Longbranch itself, right behind the old post office. There were 2 homes there that were owned by the Glasson family, and my dad rented one of the homes there. It was probably twice as big as the cabin we had up at Art Otto's farm. And we lived there for a short time, and then we moved away for about 1.5 years to Darrington, right when the war started. My dad was playing between, he got certain exemptions from the draft board for working in the woods, and that draft exemption changed when we were in Darrington, but he could get a draft exemption for working a farm if he didn't have any kids over a certain age, as I recall. So that's why he came back to Longbranch, and Slim Martin owned the farm, which is now Kakiki Farm. We ran that for Slim Martin from June of 42 until January of 44. And we had lots of experiences there because my dad built the dams on the creek in the back of the property. That now there are 2 ponds there, and we raised trout there. The first trout that I know of, the rainbow trout that was raised in the area. We had about 30 head of cattle and a couple dozen pigs, and I don't think we had any chickens there, but my grandpa had a big chicken ranch, so there was always eggs and chicken available from him. But
And where was your grandpa's chicken ranch?
right across the main highway from the Longbranch Cemetery.
Yeah, okay.
He had originally 40 acres, and then he doubled it in size, and then he got some land up on the hill behind the property for tax title back in the 30s. And so altogether he ended up with about 135 acres there. And he also owned a piece of property right next to George Rickart's place on the southern end of the peninsula, which is now the Girl Scout camp for many years. The Girl Scouts bought it from my grandfather. And
It's called Soundview Camp now, I think.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right.
And so anyway, that property belonged to my grandfather in the mid 40s, and he sold it to the Girl Scouts in the late 40s.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my dad and I used to go down there and go duck hunting because there's a nice spit down there, and the ducks in bad weather would hole up in the calm water behind the spit. And after he sold the property, we couldn't go down there and hunt anymore.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now you indicated that you went to your very first grade there at what we call a food bank here on the peninsula now. And I was wondering if you have any recollection of memories before you started school. Any classmates you played with, or what you did for entertainment?
We had a number of cousins, all of Johnson. There's a number of Johnson families, and they were all cousins. My August Johnson and my grandfather were cousins. Their mothers in Sweden were sisters. And so I've got a family tree on both sides of the family that goes back to 1715 in Sweden. Anyway, Ragnar Johnson, Ernie Johnson, George Johnson, all of their kids were cousins of ours, and we played with them all the time, and they were all living in Longbranch at one time or another.
How did preschool kids or children spend their time before they entered school when they had all this time?
Well, when we were here before I started the first grade, we lived on that farm for about a year. And so I don't recall, I remember going to my grandparents' place, and they had a big garden, and we would go there and pick berries, and both grandparents had fruit trees, picked apples and cherries and so forth during the summer. I remember in the January of '43 we had a big blizzard, and on the 15th of January we were living on the farm then, and there was only a couple of people that could get out and about because they had good-sized tractors, and my dad was one of those. So he took a tractor and a trailer and took grocery orders from all the neighbors and went all the way up to Joe's Bay to the store there to pick up groceries. And they dropped us off at my grandparents' place on the way because it was too cold for us kids to ride in that trailer all the way up there and back. So I remember that thing. And my grandfather made me a pair of skis, just like he made his own skis in Sweden, and he made them. He was a carpenter by trade and had a great workshop and woodworking tools of all kinds, so he made me a pair of skis. And we had snow on the ground. We didn't have any electric power or telephone service for 10 days during that storm, and so I got to try my skis out for the first time. I was about 5.5 at the time.
I thought it was very interesting. You showed me the skates here that we have on display that your father made.
My grandfather.
Your grandfather made
My
those.
grandfather
Excuse me.
made those, yeah.
Okay, your grandfather made those, and those are.
He had half a dozen pairs of those, as I recall, and in the wintertime, a lot of the ponds and the swampy areas froze up hard enough that we could go out and ice skate on the ponds and so forth. So we used those a lot when I was a little kid. I remember Felucci Bay having a sheet of ice across it, you know, and I don't know when the last time you ever saw ice on Felucci Bay, but.
Yeah, I don't think there's too many people that remember ice on Felucci Bay these days. Yeah. When I ask you what you did or what you played or how children played before they went to school, it really kind of sounded like most of the activities were chore oriented. I mean, the sustenance, living around the farm, picking the berries, or bringing in the eggs, or just a lot of stuff. I didn't have a lot of like kick the can type of or hide and go seek time.
Once in a while, the neighbor kids, some of the Rickards down the hill from us, came over and played, but that didn't happen very often. Probably we had more interface with cousins and other friends our age when our folks they loved to play pinochle, and there was a pinochle party going somewhere, every week, sometimes more often than that, and we'd go with the folks to the Rickards or the Sommerfelds, where they had a pinochle game going, and we'd play with their kids and we'd play until 2, 3 in the morning while they played pinochle.
Sure. Can you relate to us what the very first day was when you went to school there in the school at home?
It was kind of traumatic because the day I was supposed to start school or thereabouts, my mother had emergency appendicitis problem, and I remember Mr. Martin and my dad figured out it was bad enough they needed to get her to a hospital.
Yeah. Mr. Martin, who?
Mr. Martin owned the farm that we were operating there in Longbranch.
Yeah.
Anyway, they called ahead to Gig Harbor, where the ferry was that went across to Tacoma. and told them to hold the ferry because they were coming with an emergency. So they put her in the back seat of the car, and they dropped my sister and I off at our grandparents', and they went down the highway at top speed that they could achieve, and they were holding the ferry for them when they got to Gig Harbor, and they got her over to St. Joseph's where they operated on her. And she was in the hospital for about 10 days. So in the meantime, I was supposed to start school. Well, we spent a few days at my grandparents', and my grandmother took me in her old 38 Ford van up to the Lake Bay School. The school used to be right by the big hall there in Longbranch, but they closed that just a year or two before I started school, so then I had to go to what is now your food bank at Lake Bay to start school. So I was very upset about that. First, my mom wasn't around, and my grandma took me up there, and I didn't know hardly a kid in school. I was the oldest of all the cousins, so they hadn't started school yet. And I had one of the older Johnson boys was going to school, but he was not in the same room I was in. He was across the hall in another grade. And so reflecting back on that school, that was a traumatic first day.
I bet.
And then I got on the school bus to go home, and at times when the regular school bus driver wasn't available, there were seniors in high school that drove the school bus. And in this case, Earl Sommerfeld was a senior in high school, and he was driving the school bus. And I knew him because my folks played pinochle at his house. He was a senior in high school, and anyway, he said, "What are you doing on this bus?" And I said, "Well, I'm staying at my grandma's at your old grandparents' place." And he said, "Okay," so he dropped me off there. But the problem was when my mom came back from the hospital, we moved back onto the farm down in the lower peninsula. And the school bus driver there didn't know where to drop me off. And they went, and she drove right past the farm, and I started hollering at her and got all upset because she didn't stop for me to get off at the farm. And she said, "Well, you can walk back from here." And I said, "No, I'm not." So I made her back the bus up about a quarter of a mile down the road to drop me off in front of the house. So,
were the roads paved at that time?
some of them were. Rouse Hill was not paved,
Yeah.
but the main, as I recall, the main road up to the Taylor Bay Road was paved. I don't think the road that, as it continued on down to the end of the peninsula, down to Devil's Head, I don't think that part of the road was paved at that time.
Oh, the reason I was wondering was when you mentioned that you went full speed to get your mother's attention, medical attention, and I was just envisioning maybe a gravel road, but
No,
it was paved. I
the main highway that you have now
Right.
was paved all the way from the Longbranch store, I remember, all the way to Gig Harbor.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was concrete. A good portion of that main highway was built in like 1935 or 36, so it was relatively new, and it was concrete.
Right.
And so you had this click, 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 click. They had these expansion joints, every 20 feet or so on the highway.
Uh-huh.
And so it was relatively new and in good shape. Except in those days, we had to drive all the way down into Gig Harbor and through town and then back out on the peninsula, the north of there, to get to the ferry that went over to Tacoma.
What other experiences can you recall from the first grade there?
Well, I remember where there's an old, like a parking lot or something now by the food bank. That was the baseball field. And that was the primary game that everybody played when I was in the first grade. I wasn't big enough to play with most of the kids. They had like 8 grades in the school there. And the older kids were all playing baseball there. I know I saw one get a bad concussion one day because the catcher wound up to throw the ball to the second baseman. Someone was trying to steal second base, and he nailed the kid that was batting right behind the ear, and he went down like a ton of bricks, and they packed him off the field. I remember that clear as a bell. And we also played dodgeball on the other side of the school, where there's two houses there now. They didn't exist when I went to school there.
Do you happen to recall how many students were in your first grade class?
No, I really don't. And you know, I was in that building a number of years ago, and there was pictures of some of the classes in that building, but the one for the first grade class in 43, 44 isn't there.
Uh-huh.
But they have classes before and afters that were there, so I don't know. There were three grades in one room, so there couldn't have been a whole lot of people in each class.
Yeah. Overall, what would be an estimate of how many children were in the building total, all grades? Or is
Maybe
that-
60,
Yeah, okay.
something like that.
Did you have the same teacher all day, or was there any kind
Yes, yeah, we had one teacher that handled the first, second, and third grade, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all in that same room all day long.
Yeah, right.
The only thing that stands out to me is they gave us all vaccinations for smallpox and diphtheria at the same time.
Uh-huh.
And they lined us all up, and they did it down in the basement. And I remember they had a whole school lined up there to get your shots. And I had no idea what was going off there, because I didn't remember getting any shot. You know, I know I'd had one when I had the fell in the bee's nest, but I didn't recall getting that shot either.
What was your reaction to the instruction at that time? And understand this would be coming from a 5-6-year-old child. Was the teacher a strict disciplinarian, or was it really interesting to go there and really want to learn? How did that go?
I don't know. One of the problems I had was it being my first year in school, I caught every bug that was available to catch in that class. So I missed a lot of school because of illness. I had chicken pox and cold after cold after cold, and I remember the teacher telling me sometime, like in the end of March, that if I missed one more day of school, I'd have to do the first grade over again.
Oh.
And that, you know, really upset me. So I had to make sure that I was there, regardless of how bad my colds were. After that, I finished out the year.
Yeah, that would be kind of harsh, even by today's standards. Bring your cold in and spread it around to everybody else.
Yeah, it wasn't any fun.
Yeah. So you completed the first grade.
I finished the first grade, and then that summer we moved down to Grace Harbor because my dad had a job there for the rest of the war. In fact, we stayed on Grace Harbor out in the town of Cosmopolis until I was finished the 7th grade, and then we moved to Lake Quinault, and my sister still lives there.
Uh-huh. You indicated that you came back kind of regularly to visit folks to the Key Peninsula, and what are some of the distinguishing changes that you've particularly noticed between your visits?
The big thing in the summertime was we were always down here for the 4th of July weekend. The Rickards always had a nice big party on the beach, and they always had a baseball game. And my dad and his younger brother both played on the ball club team at Longbranch, and he'd come back and they played first and second base respectively. And so everybody turned out for the baseball team, or you know, and their big ball game on the 4th of July. So we took in a lot of those during the late 40s and early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you saw everybody, all the old friends that you knew when you lived down there. They were all at the ball game. So
Sure.
and of course that ball field is right across from well, it's right next to the Longbranch Community Hall now. And that's where the old school was out in the right field. They had a grandstand there, and they had a chicken wire fence down both foul lines. And there was a bench on the inside of that fence, and all the old timers sat on that bench. And all their wives and families sat in the car right behind the bench. And if someone hit a high foul ball, it just cleared the fence, someone was going to get a broken windshield, and there was at least one every game.
That's good. That's good.
Another thing I remember when we were on the farm that sticks in my mind was that aircraft from McCord Field would come over there and practice over our field. And P-38s would come over there and do dog fights, simulate dog fights, right over the farm. And some of them came down to the point where I was sure they were going to fly right into the ground. They were so low. And the pilots would stand there, you know, sit there, and as they flew by, they'd wave at me.
Would they time this for the 4th of July ball games?
No, this was any time. They were over there, you know, all summer long. It seemed like there were several planes over there. But some of them really got low, right down over our fields, you know, and the fields went down into a valley, and they were right down in the bottom of that valley sometimes. But you know, I don't think they were more than 30, 40 feet off the ground at times.
Oh wow!
So it was pretty exciting to watch them.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So later on, you went to high school
At Lake Quinault.
at Lake Quinault, and did your Navy career start after you finished that, or?
No, I went to University of Washington, and while I was going to school there, jobs are kind of hard to come by, and I ended up working for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska during the summers. So I went up there for 5-6 months each year to work in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me 5 years to graduate from University of Washington. At the end of my school, the draft board was on me, and so I shopped around to see where I could get the best deal. And I had an uncle who'd been in the Navy during the war, and he said, "Well, you got a business degree, and he says the best deal I know of in the Navy is a supply corps officer. So go down there and tell a recruiter that you'll sign up if he'll give you a supply corps designator." And so that's what I did, and the guy said, "Oh, I don't know if I can do that." You know, I said, "Well, give it your best shot." And I walked out of the office, and 2 weeks later he called me and said, "I got your supply corps designator for you." So I spent 30 years in the Navy Supply Corps.
So what year was that you joined the Navy?
1960.
1960. Okay. So after 60 or 30 years, that's 1990 approximately then that you retired from the Navy. That's good. Okay.
August of 1990.
Can you share some of your activities that you did out here at Bangor? I mean, kind of setting up just a heck of a lot of what was going on out there.
Well, the operation at Bangor is built around the Trident submarine, and in 1971 I was stationed in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and I was selected to chair a team of data systems developers from 5 different commands to put together the design for a new data system to support the Trident submarine. The Trident submarine was being put together under a new operational concept where you have 2 crews. You keep the submarine underway virtually all the time. With the nuclear reactor, it's got long legs, and they have 2 crews. So you're in port for about 20 days, change crews, send it back out to sea, and you keep it underway. for a long period of time, several months before you bring it in and change crews again, send it back out. So the logistics data system was a fairly complex integrated system that we started the design on in '71. And 10 years later, I went back to Mechanicsburg, and I had a different type of job there. I had all of the software programmers that put together the actual computer programs that implemented the design that we started 10 years before. So by the time we got the first Trident submarine, the Ohio, out at Bangor, we had that data system up and running to support the short recycle periods that they were in port, where they had to replace equipment and do all the repairs and so forth. And it's still in work, it's still operational today.
Yeah, that's interesting. Didn't detect any military secrets there, but, but you may have been privy to some at some time. That's interesting.
It's a very complex system. The biggest hurdle was acquiring all the data we needed to load the system with, because the system it covers the entire spectrum of maintaining and overhauling a submarine.
So when you say load the system, you mean like load the weapons, or?
The information in the, say you have a pump. We not only had the breakdown of the pump and all the piece parts, we had to load the information about what skills are needed to repair this pump, what kind of tools you need to repair this pump, etc., etc. And all the piece parts were in there. And we had to hook up the financial program, so if the piece parts aren't on hand at the submarine base to do the job when that submarine comes in, it automatically orders them and pays for them and tracks the delivery of the parts back in time to do the job.
Interesting. Interesting. So when did you retire from the Navy?
In the summer of 1990.
Summer of 1990, yeah. I noticed your cap, it had USS...
University of Washington. That's it. Our daughter used to swim for the University of Washington, so that she got me that cap.
Well, I guess it was on your jacket.
On the jacket, I've got, I was on 3 ships in the Navy. The first one was Iwo Jima.
Yeah.
And I was on the nuclear cruiser Bainbridge.
Uh-huh.
And then I put the USS Belleau Wood, which is another carrier, amphibious assault ship in commission. Yeah. I was on the pre-con detail for the Iwo Jima as well.
Did you spend much time of your Navy career in the Bremerton area, or was it all Mideast?
No, because